They were the wonders of their age. Colossal metropolises that defied gravity, geography, and common sense. They held the secrets of the universe, the wealth of entire continents, and the power of gods. And then, they vanished. Not just the people, but the memory of them. Today, we peel back the sand, the jungle, and the ocean to reveal the 10 most incredible empires that history tried to erase. In the heart of the blistering Sahara, there stood a city built on a foundation of white gold, salt. This was the Ghana Empire. It was so wealthy that even the royal dogs wore collars of solid gold. Merchants traveled for months across the dunes just to trade a pound of salt for a pound of gold. But, as the climate shifted and the desert grew hungry, the trade routes withered. Today, the majestic stone city of Kumbi Saleh lies buried beneath the dunes, a silent ghost of a golden age. The collapse of Ghana wasn't a single explosion, but a slow, invisible suffocation. As the Almoravids pushed from the north, they didn't just bring swords, they brought a new trade reality that bypassed the empire's desert tolls. Simultaneously, overgrazing and a shifting climate turned the lush grasslands around the capital into the parched dust of the Sahara. The white gold of salt became a burden as the water dried up. By the time the empire officially dissolved, the people had already scattered, leaving their gold-collared dogs and stone mansions to be swallowed by the encroaching dunes. Imagine a city so powerful it was known as the capital of East Anglia. Dunwich was a thriving medieval port, filled with grand stone churches and bustling docks. But the sea is a jealous neighbor. Over centuries, violent storms and coastal erosion literally pulled the city into the waves. One by one, the churches slid off the cliffs. Local legend says that during a storm, you can still hear the church bells ringing from the bottom of the ocean. Dunwich's downfall was a war against the geography itself. For centuries, the city ignored the warning signs of the rising North Sea, believing their stone walls and wealthy harbor were permanent. But the invisible culprit was a series of massive storms in the 13th and 14th centuries that choked the harbor with silt. Once the trade ships could no longer dock, the city's economic heart stopped beating. Without the money to maintain sea defenses, the very ground beneath their feet became the enemy. It is a haunting reminder that nature doesn't negotiate with even the wealthiest of ports. 600 feet above the Sri Lankan jungle sits a massive orange rock plateau. This was Sigiriya, the fortress of the lion. Built by a paranoid king who feared his own brother, it featured a palace in the clouds, water gardens that still work today, and a mirror wall so polished the king could see his reflection. After his fall, the jungle reclaimed the rock, hiding this architectural miracle for nearly 1,000 years. The fall of Sigiriya was as much a psychological collapse as a military one. King Kashyapa had built a masterpiece of paranoia, believing his sky-high fortress was impregnable. But in the end, it wasn't the walls that failed. It was a single decision. During the final battle, the king moved his elephant to avoid a hidden swamp. His army, thinking he was retreating, broke ranks and fled in a panic. Kashyapa, realizing his mirror wall would now only reflect his defeat, took his own life on the battlefield. The palace in the clouds was instantly abandoned, proving that even the most perfect fortress is useless if the leader loses the trust of his men. Across the plains of Myanmar, over 10,000 golden and red brick temples once rose toward the sky. This was pagan, the spiritual heart of an empire. At its peak, the horizon was a literal forest of gold. But when the Mongol hordes arrived from the north, the empire shattered. The people fled, leaving behind a silent landscape of ruins that still haunts the horizon today. Pagan fell because it prioritized the spiritual world while ignoring the growing shadows on its borders. For 200 years, the empire spent its vast agricultural wealth building thousands of temples rather than a standing army. When the Mongols demanded tribute, the king's refusal sparked an invasion the empire was never equipped to handle. But the invisible blow was internal. The temples had become so large they had sucked the kingdom's economy dry, leaving no resources for defense. The Mongols didn't need to destroy the temples, they simply broke the system that kept them standing. Most people think of Vikings as raiders, but in Greenland they built a little Rome. Gardar was a sophisticated settlement with a massive stone cathedral and a great hall for feasting. They traded rare walrus ivory for European silks. But as the Little Ice Age froze the fjords and cut off trade, the Vikings vanished. They left behind only their stone walls and the skeletons of their livestock, frozen in the permafrost. The Vikings of Gardar were defeated by a changing world they refused to adapt to. As the climate cooled into the Little Ice Age, the sea ice cut off the vital supply ships from Europe. The invisible cause of their end was cultural stubbornness. They continued to raise cattle on frozen land instead of learning to hunt like the local Inuit. Malnutrition and isolation turned the Arctic Rome into a graveyard. When the last ship finally arrived decades later, they found only empty stone halls and a cathedral, filled with the ghosts of a people who chose tradition over survival. On the legendary Silk Road sat Merv, once the largest city in the entire world. It was a center of science, culture, and massive libraries holding thousands of years of human knowledge. It was the queen of the world. That all ended in 1221, when the Mongols arrived. In one of the most brutal sieges in history, the city was leveled so completely that even the foundations were lost to the desert winds. But the downfall of this queen of the world wasn't just the result of a single siege. It was an invisible rot of overconfidence. Merv believed its massive libraries and intellectual status made it untouchable. When the Mongol envoys arrived, the city's leadership made the fatal error of executing them, underestimating the sheer scale of the retribution that would follow. The invisible cause of the fall was a total diplomatic collapse and a failure to recognize that the world's power had shifted from the library to the sword. In a matter of days, the irrigation systems that kept the desert oasis alive were destroyed, ensuring that even if the people survived, the city never would. We are halfway through our journey into the shadows of history, but the most chilling disappearances are still ahead. If you're finding value in these invisible truths, hit the like button. It tells the algorithm that deep history still matters. But more importantly, look at the screen. Of the 5 empires we've covered so far, which one do you think had the most preventable fall? Type your theory in the comments. I read every single one. Deep in southern Africa, explorers were shocked to find massive curving walls built of stone without a single drop of mortar. This was Great Zimbabwe, the hub of a massive gold trade. They produced intricate gold jewelry and sacred soapstone birds. When the gold mines ran dry, the city was abandoned. For centuries, Europeans refused to believe that an African civilization could build something so grand. But the stones tell the truth. The silence that eventually fell over these massive stone walls was caused by an invisible exhaustion of the land. For centuries, Great Zimbabwe thrived because it sat on a gold mine. But as the easy-to-reach veins of ore ran dry, the economic heart of the city began to skip beats. Simultaneously, the sheer size of the population, 18,000 people in a single stone complex, put an impossible strain on the surrounding forests and grazing lands. The invisible fall happened when the food ran out and the gold lost its value. The people didn't leave because of a war. They left because the earth could no longer feed their ambitions, leaving behind a granite labyrinth that has puzzled the world ever since. Empires don't just vanish, and they leave clues for those willing to look. We spend weeks researching these invisible patterns, so you can see the world differently. If you want to be here when we uncover the next lost chapter, make sure you're subscribed to Invisible Empires. Join the few who choose to look beneath the surface. Rising out of a vast blue lake was a city that looked like a dream, Tenochtitlan. The Aztec capital was a marvel of engineering, with floating gardens, massive pyramids, and clean streets that put European cities to shame. When the Spanish arrived, they thought they were hallucinating. Today, the ruins of this floating empire sit beneath the heavy concrete of Mexico City. The dream of this floating city turned into a nightmare through an invisible enemy the Aztecs never saw coming: smallpox. While the Spanish cannons and steel swords were devastating, it was a biological collapse that truly broke the empire. Because the city was an island with high population density, the virus traveled like lightning through the canals. By the time the final siege began, half the city was already dead or incapacitated. The invisible fall was a total loss of the biological immune system, coupled with the fact that the Aztecs' neighboring enemies, tired of the empire's heavy taxes and sacrifices, joined the invaders to ensure the White Pyramids were torn down stone by stone. For centuries, explorers whispered about a white city hidden in the impenetrable Honduran rainforest. They called it the City of the Monkey God. It was so hidden that it took modern LiDAR technology to find it. Beneath the canopy, archaeologists found a city untouched for 500 years, where stone gods sit silently waiting for people who will never return. Why would a city of stone gods be abandoned so suddenly that jars were left sitting on the ground? The invisible culprit here was likely a great dying, a wave of disease that moved through the trade routes faster than any human messenger. But there is also evidence of a spiritual collapse. Archaeologists believe the people may have come to view the city as cursed after a series of natural disasters or plagues. They didn't just move out. They decommissioned the city, ritually breaking their pottery and burying their statues before vanishing into the mountains. The fall of the monkey god city was a total psychological break, where the people decided the jungle was safer than the walls they had built. Before Rome, before the pyramids, there was Uruk. This is where civilization began. It was the home of the legendary king Gilgamesh, and the place where the first human words were ever written into clay. With walls that stretched for miles and a population of 80,000, it was the first true metropolis. But the rivers changed course, the earth turned to salt, and the mother of all cities was swallowed by the Iraqi sands. The fall of the first true metropolis was the result of an invisible, man-made environmental disaster. To feed 80,000 people, Uruk's engineers created a massive system of irrigation canals. However, in the intense Mesopotamian heat, the standing water evaporated, leaving behind tiny amounts of salt. Over centuries, this salt built up in the soil until the land became toxic to the very wheat that sustained the empire. This salinization was an invisible poison. As the harvest failed, the social contract broke, and the city that invented writing eventually had no one left to read its history. The mother of all cities died not with a bang, but with the slow, salty crusting of its once fertile earth. You've seen how Uruk fell to salt and how Tenochtitlan fell to the unseen. But what if I told you the most dangerous empire of all isn't on this list, because it's still currently hidden? If you're ready to see the invisible forces shaping our modern world, you need to see our investigation. Meet the Rothschild of the East, the dark truth. Click the video on your screen now to see what they don't want you to find. These empires remind us that nothing, no matter how grand, is permanent. But as long as we keep digging, their stories will never truly die. Which of these lost worlds would you visit? Let us know in the comments. Thanks for watching Invisible Empires. I'll see you in the next empire.